Energy is the currency that our body uses for everything. From muscle recovery to running a marathon to the brain thinking and the heart beating, energy is at the core of everything. And when we're constantly utilizing more energy than what we're taking in, the body starts to make cutbacks. This is what we call low energy availability. And when it happens over a chronic period of time to athletes, it becomes relative energy deficiency in sport. Now, traditionally, this is associated with the female athlete triad and specifically seen in young female athletes or high-level competitive female athletes, but it's not just females that have to worry about this. It can happen to men too, team sport athletes, fitness enthusiasts, and even non-athletes themselves. So today we're going to discuss all things energy deficiency. We're going to talk about what energy availability is, how low energy availability in REDS affects the body, what some of the signs and symptoms are, and what groups of people might be at a higher risk for LEA and REDS. We're going to talk about strategies for prevention and support, and then we're going to get into the role of testing and monitoring throughout care. Now, this is meant to be more of a generalized video. We're going to talk about surface level things, and in future videos, we'll dive into some of these more specific topics. So let's just jump right into it. Before we can talk about what LEA is and what REDS is, we've got to just first understand what energy availability even means in the body. We talked about a little bit already that energy is used in every process in our body, and we have to consume that energy. That's why food is so important, right? The nutrition that we're taking in, the food that we're eating is providing the body energy. So when we look at the energy availability, we have to look at is the energy that we're consuming, the energy that we're burning, and then we divide that by the total fat-free mass in the body in kilograms. So this is the total lean body mass weighed out in kilograms. So this is going to give us a number. Now, if we want to have plenty of energy, we want that number to be as high as possible. Not so high that we're going to start gaining weight, but the biggest problem comes when we start to see that number creep down. And for female athletes, that cutoff is around 30. So if we're consuming less than 30, or if we have less than 30 free calories per kilogram of lean muscle mass, we're going to start to cut back on those metabolic processes. So when we talk about this, it's very important to understand that, you would think that your body's going to start to utilize all of this energy for those very important metabolic processes first, like your brain thinking, your heart beating, your lungs digesting, and it does to some extent. Those are going to be our primary kind of critical factors that the body's always going to be pushing energy towards. What it's not going to start pushing energy towards and what it's going to start to withdraw energy from is things like our hormones, things like our metabolism, things like our thyroid function, things like our bones, and that's what we're going to really start to see deficiencies in as we get into this low energy availability. Now, when we have short-term low energy availability, not a big deal. The body can bounce back from that relatively quickly. It's when we get into this long-term low energy availability, that's when we start to develop REDS, which again is that relative energy deficiency in sport. And this is where we can start to have really severe impacts on our performance and on our health. This is seen oftentimes in female athletes, specifically endurance athletes, and those women who are in aesthetic sports just because of the body image associated with those sports. It's also seen in weight class sports like wrestling, combat sports, rowing, where we got to be as light as possible or we've got to fit into a certain category. The other place that we see this is when we're dieting. So extreme dieting going along with fitness is not typically going to be a recipe for healthy nutrition and healthy energy availability. And the last part is going to be in chronic illnesses. This is going to be a lot of people who are using extra nutrition or extra energy to drive metabolic processes, or people with chronic things like gut issues where they're not going to even be absorbing the energy that their body's taking in because of how bad of shape the gut is in. So there's a lot of different people that are going to have to pay attention to this and really be careful of the energy that they're consuming on a daily basis. So let's look at how this affects the body. Now, one of the biggest things is hormone production. So we talk about the female athlete triad. One of the hallmarks of the female athlete triad is going to be that amenorrhea. And so this is going to be the loss of your menstrual cycle or your period because of this low energy availability and the output or the excessive stress on the body. This is something that we work with all the time in the office. We have women coming in that aren't cycling. Their hormones are all over the place. They're trying to get pregnant and they can't. They're trying to come off of birth control because they were put on it for terrible cycles. It happens all the time. And it's not just athletes that this affects, but body image is a big deal in females, especially young females. And so diet and energy intake really suffers as a result of that. So really being able to understand how this is affecting the hormones in the body is super important. And this isn't something that we want to get super into for the sake of this video. There may be future videos. So if you want to see a future video all about hormonal regulation and energy availability, drop it in the comments below. I'll be sure to do a much more in-depth video on that. We can also dive into how to fuel specifically for sports for females and for males, so we can kind of get into that a little bit more. But to keep it surface level, basically what happens is we've got these HPA axes, HPT, HPG axes, which is basically the brain's communication with the organs that produce hormones. So for the sake of today's conversation, we'll keep it basic. We'll talk about the HPG, or the hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis. And this is going to be the brain communication to, in the females, we're talking about the ovaries. So what happens is the brain produces a hormone called GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. This tells the pituitary to release two hormones, luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle stimulating hormone. Now these go into the ovaries. They do a couple things, like telling the follicles to mature. They tell the follicle to produce estrogen. They create a spike, which causes ovulation. Then we get an increase in progesterone and estrogen in the second half of the cycle. Now the GnRH, or the gonadotropin releasing hormone, is released from the hypothalamus in a pulsatile frequency. What will happen is when we have low energy availability, we're going to reduce that pulsatile frequency of the GnRH. We're going to have a subsequent drop in LH and FSH, which is going to reduce our estrogen levels. When estrogen levels don't rise, we don't get ovulation, and we don't get the high levels of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. We're also not going to have a normal period when this starts to happen. So it's one of the biggest reasons that we see energy availability start to lead to that amenorrheic state, because of the effect on the hypothalamus. So if we want to have normal periods in athletes, we've got to make sure that we're fueling properly. It's not just about the output. The most important thing is the input, which is how many calories are you consuming, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. The other thing that's going to start to happen is we're going to start to see a decrease in T3, which is the active form of the thyroid hormone. This is what increases a lot of metabolic processes. So we're going to see a shift of increased T3 production in things like our brown adipose tissue, our cardiovascular tissue, and our brain tissue, but we're going to see a decrease in a lot of other areas that control general metabolic rate and energy. We're also going to see an increase in cortisol, which is going to be because of that prolonged stress state. Now, none of these things are good if you're a cycling female and you're trying to perform at a very high level. So we have to start to understand what some of the early warning signs are. The other things that can happen that we see all the time with low energy availability is going to be a decrease in bone health. And one of the biggest reasons for this, especially in females, is because estrogen is one of the biggest things that maintains bone density and bone health. And as estrogen levels start to decline, our bone health is going to suffer as a result of that. In athletes, this a lot of times will increase our risk of injuries. It's also going to lead to that increased risk of stress fractures. So we see it all the time in cross-country runners and track runners. I had a really good friend who was a really good cross-country runner, constantly dealing with stress fractures, right? So we can start to prevent this if we can look at the early warning signs. The other thing is immune function. We're going to constantly be getting sick because the immune system just doesn't have the energy to keep up with the kind of environment around us. And that chronic illness state is going to really affect performance because we can't push as hard if our body's trying to fight infections. We're going to have a reduction in metabolism, primarily through that reduced T3 pathway. We're going to see psychological health, mood swings, anxiety, low levels of motivation. We're also going to see levels of recovery that are going to really start to tank and deplete. Low estrogen levels can also have an impact on cardiovascular function because it can reduce our nitrous oxide stimulation, which affects vasodilation. So this is going to affect and impact in a negative way blood supply and circulation throughout the body. So there's so many different areas of the body that can be affected beyond just the hormonal state. And we focus on this mainly in females because females are kind of the female athlete triad. That's where we put a lot of the research at. But this happens a lot in guys as well. We get this hypogonadal, low testosterone level in men, especially endurance athletes. And so this is something that we need to be aware of. So what does this look like? What are some of the early warning signs? One of the biggest early warning signs is going to be reaching kind of a plateau with your training. So we always get into these training blocks. And the reason we do training blocks is because you're going to put a bunch of effort in, you're going to train. Eventually you'll kind of reach this plateau, at which point you want to step off the training. We go into like a kind of a rest week or a rest block of training. Our training's going to come down a little bit, then we get into another training block and we're going to be able to push. What happens is if we continue pushing and we get to this plateau and we try to push through it, we get into this overtraining state. Now there's two different types of overtraining. We get overreaching, and then we get functional overtraining, then we get actual overtraining. And in the overreaching state, you can kind of push a little bit further. In the overtraining state, you're going to have to take some time off to really allow your body to recover. But in that functional overtraining state, typically just a couple of days, it's all it's going to take to really recover from that. If we get into this actual fully overtrained state, this is where it's going to take months to recover. So the early warning signs are when you start to bump into that plateau, if energy doesn't seem like it's there, if the strength's not there, if we're not recovering or sleeping as well as we should be. Again, keep that in mind that this could be an energy deficit issue. The poor sleep and the persistent fatigue, also a huge red flag here. For women, the period's going to start to be all over the place. It may not just completely disappear, but if it starts to become irregular, if it starts to be super light, super heavy, lots of clotting, cramping, or mood changes that you're not used to having, those are all early warning signs that something is off with your hormones and your cycle, and it's something that we need to take a closer look at. Unfortunately, it's happens to all sorts of girls. My wife lost her period for 10 months when she was in cross country. And because it's so normalized, people don't realize that this is an actual physiological problem that's going off. And their coaches and their athletic trainers, who are oftentimes the first line of defense here, the first point of contact, aren't going to really understand what's happening. So oftentimes these early signs of LEA go undiagnosed or untreated. The other thing is that we're going to get those constant injuries. So if you feel like you're constantly getting hurt, constantly having to step back at training or take time off, this is another warning sign that your body's not recovering and repairing. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can track our body's physiology. That's why things like the Whoop strap, things like an Oura ring are so important, because they can start to actually measure what's happening under the surface inside the body, things like our HRV, things like our sleep quality, REM and deep sleep, and those can really give us good understanding of how our body's recovering and repairing before you may actually be able to feel things. And so for females, wearing something like an Oura ring that can also measure your temperature spikes can also give you a really good understanding of when you're ovulating. And if you start to see temperature spikes that are all over the place, your body's out of whack. If you start to see that HRV really start to take a tank, that you're not recovering as well. If the resting heart rate's rising, again, we're going to be not recovering quite as well. And those are things that you really need to start paying attention to. I look at my Whoop strap every morning and I see that, my sleep wasn't great. Even though maybe I feel okay today, I know my sleep wasn't very good. And if I continue to push and don't sleep, that's going to catch up to me later in the week. And so I really need to start paying attention to that before I start to see the signs of that. So we talked a little bit about who's at risk here. The endurance athletes, the people with a really high output of energy. It's not just about the energy intake. If its energy intake is normal, but energy output or exercise is significantly increased, those people are going to be at a huge risk, right? So we've got to make sure that we're balancing energy intake and energy output. It's one of the other reasons that things like an Oura ring or a Whoop strap can be so beneficial, because if I go into my Whoop strap, it'll tell me exactly how many calories I'm burning. I was just working with an endurance athlete who's training for high-level marathons. He's running really, really quick marathon paces. And so because of that, he's training all the time. And, we base everything off of this 2,000-calorie diet. But I don't know if that's actually correct for you until we actually can measure the calorie output. So we pulled up his Whoop strap. We were able to look at what his calorie output was. And he was expending a ton of energy. And he looked at it and was like, oh, my gosh. I had no idea I was burning that many calories, and I'm definitely nowhere close to consuming that many calories. So when we're looking at his hormones and his blood work, we're looking and seeing, testosterone's a little bit low, immune function's a little bit low, red blood cells are a little bit low. And none of these are completely out of the range, right? They're just slightly low. But if we're trying to be at our best and perform at our optimal, we want testosterone to be balanced. We want the immune system to be balanced. We want red blood cells to be on the higher end, right? And so if we're not consuming enough energy, that's never going to happen. So this is where looking at the Whoop strap was so important, because we could say, okay, let's increase energy input, and then we can work on all this other stuff that may need to happen. But we've got to make sure we've got that foundation first, right? The other people are going to be older adults, poor intake, people with chronic illnesses, people with appetite loss is another really big one. And I hear this all the time, is that people just aren't hungry. Now, this is also something that kind of perpetuates these issues in females, because as our estrogen levels change, that changes our insulin sensitivity, and it changes our appetite, right? And so a lot of times women will notice in the first half of their cycle, they've got a much bigger appetite because their estrogen levels are lower. In the second half of the cycle, when estrogen levels should be rising, that appetite a lot of times comes down. And if we're creating a deficit in intake because we're just not hungry, but the training volume stays the same, now we've created this 2-week period of time of Aaliyah. And if we continue to do that cycle after cycle after cycle, we're going to really put ourselves in a big deficit. So understanding that, this is where my output is, and no matter what, even if I don't feel like I want to eat, I need to eat enough calories in order to match that output. And sometimes it just takes forcing yourself to eat the calories to make sure that you can, get that energy into the body. So again, let's talk about some strategies here for prevention, right? Number one is looking at the early warning signs, right? So are we training and recovering? Do we feel like we have as much energy? Do I feel like our mood is stable? Are we sleeping well? Can we focus on other things? Are we recovering properly, right? If we're not, if any of those things are off, it's time to kind of pump the brakes and do a double check, right? Also making sure that we're eating before and after meals. For women, this is especially important, making sure, especially if you're doing endurance athletes, or endurance sports like running, we really want to make sure we're not doing that fasted. So for guys, fasting is not as bad. Fasting is great for guys. For females, especially if our hormones aren't balanced, depending on where you're at in your cycle, you've got to be really careful. So for the most part, having some carbs, 30 grams or so of carbs, 15 grams of protein right before an endurance bout of exercise is super, super beneficial for you. And then making sure that you're getting your protein in throughout the day, making sure you're getting a quick source of carbs after the workout to rebuild and pull that sugar back into the muscles that just utilized all of it during the exercise is super important. We want to include nutrient-dense carbohydrates as well. It's not just about energy, but it's also about the nutrition that's coming from it. So from a metabolic and a physiological standpoint, we need all those nutrients that come along with food. So I don't want you just eating a bunch of Cheerios or Honey Smacks or whatever before and after workouts, right? So fruit, berries, things like that are super beneficial because it's going to really work to increase that blood sugar level. Let's talk about training adjustments. If you do start to notice some of those red flags, this is a really good opportunity to reduce training volume. Now, this is where you also have to make sure that your team is going to support you in that. Your coach and your athletic trainer really need to understand what's going on. So being able to have open lines of communication between your training staff is going to be very important. Say, hey, I'm not sleeping well. Hey, I'm not recovering well. Can we back off a little bit? And then also understanding where you're at in your training cycle. If we're not competing for another month, or if we're competing in 2 days, what we are doing now needs to be drastically different, right? And so we want to be able to perform optimally for a long period of time. And sometimes if we need to take a day or two off, that's just what we need to do, right? And so again, having those open lines of communication is super important. And the other thing is going to be, if you are not working with somebody who can test hormone levels, test your hormones, your thyroid levels, test your bone density, those things are very critically important, especially if you're already starting to see some of the issues with your cycle. Having your FSH, your LH, your estrogen, your testosterone, DHT, DHEA, cortisol levels, blood sugar levels tested. All of that is extremely important in monitoring, and also understanding how you specifically are being affected, basically, right? And all this stuff can be done, right? I work with athletes all the time. I run testing all the time, and I'm able to see kind of where an athlete's at. So a lot of times it's, let's run testing at the beginning of the season to make sure that your body's in a position where you can go into a training bout and really push hard. And then running testing halfway through the season to make sure that you haven't depleted yourself. For a lot of people, it's let's just do everything we can to hold on for as long as possible to make it through the season, and then we rebuild. A lot of guys that I'm looking at, that's kind of what the goal is. I run a lot of endurance sports myself, and so when I'm trying to make it through the end of an endurance training block, it's maximize everything in the off season, make sure I'm all the way up here before I start, and then I'm doing a bunch of stuff to make sure that I can slow down how far downhill I'm going to come. And by testing halfway through, I can see, if I'm expecting to be here, but my levels and stuff are down here, I'm in trouble. And if my race isn't until over here, I really need to take corrective action if I want to be able to perform during my race. And so testing can be a hugely, hugely important thing for that. The other thing is that there are a lot of questionnaires for this, right? So the LEAF questionnaire is the low energy availability in females questionnaire. There's also a REDS and sport care questionnaire, and both of those are going to be very helpful. The LEAF questionnaire is more of a general overview and a screening tool. This is something that would be good to have your young female athletes take, have your daughter do it, just to kind of check in and see where you're at. And then the RED questionnaire is going to be more of a in-depth, comprehensive questionnaire that somebody could do in more of a practitioner office setting. So I know this isn't a super great overview. It's just more of a kind of a top level overview. These are all things that we can dive into in the future in other videos. I want to keep these videos mostly to the 15 to 20 minute mark. I don't want to go super far over that. So this is about as much detail as we can cover in a single video. So stay tuned. If you guys want to hear more videos, like and subscribe to the channel. Drop the comments below what you want to see next, either as it relates to Leah and Reds or as it relates to other health topics. We'll do a more in-depth video on specific fueling needs for female and for male athletes, kind of depending on what your exercise and activity levels look like. We'll talk about the mental health impacts in a future video, and then we can go through specific case studies so you can look at what kind of recovery looks like, and also look at what hormone levels look like at different points in times during training blocks. So I hope you guys found this video interesting, and I hope you found it helpful. Again, it's not an all-out super in-depth video, but the main things to take away here are going to be looking for early warning signs, making sure that you're finding a way to measure your energy output and you're matching that with your energy intake, and then making sure that you have a training support team that you can talk to, that you have open lines of communication with, so that your coaches who are pushing you understand what your needs are and can help to support you the best. So take care, guys.